The Radical Secular Podcast, a demand for justice, equality, and rational public policy.
Hello and welcome back to the Radical Secular Podcast. I'm Christophe Defoe.
I'm Sean Prophet.
We at the Radical Secular take a firm and, where appropriate, uncompromising stance on more than a few issues. For example, we oppose without reservation all flavors of bigotry, including homophobia, racism, and misogyny. Still, as I've gotten older and hopefully wiser, the way I think and especially the way I talk about these sorts of issues has evolved. To be clear, I'm speaking for myself here in terms of this evolution. I'm not speaking either for the Radical Secular or other members of the Radical Secular team. Anyway, as my views have evolved, it's become increasingly clear to me that the dichotomies into which we human beings tend to split the world and the people who inhabit it rarely reflect the reality of individuals' lived experience. It turns out that we human beings are quite complicated and often embody a host of contradictions. The same is true of the civilization we've built and the conflicts in which we find ourselves. We're going to talk today a bit about these thorny issues. We'll discuss them through the lens of the phenomenon that is, and it is a phenomenon, Senator Timothy Eugene Scott of South Carolina, as well as the violence that has extinguished many Palestinian lives in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But first, I want to remind you that if you like our show, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out theradicalsecular.com, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. And if you're into reading, check out the blog at theradicalsecular.com.
Visit our website at theradicalsecular.com and sign up for free access to exclusive content and giveaways, our full library of episodes, and articles at the Radical Secular blog. Email us with your comments and suggestions, and follow us on social media.
Speaking of the blog, last week, friend of the Radical Secular, Andrew Sweet, wrote a great post for the Radical Secular blog. The post is called Playing in the Poisoned Air, and it addresses parenting in the age of climate change, among some other things. And by the way, Andrew is an author, and you should definitely check out his latest book. It's called Models and Citizens. I'm about a third of the way through it, and it's been a real pleasure to read so far. I was just reading it today. Everyone should go read that book. Everyone should also go read Andrew's post. And while you're there, check out all of the content that Sean, Joe, and I have produced on the Radical Secular blog. We post weekly, and the content is fucking fire. Sean, what do you think?
Well, I really loved Andrew's article. He addresses the issue of climate justice in terms of particulate air pollution, even indoor air pollution. This is not something a lot of people think about, and I don't want to spoil it because I want everyone to go over and read the article. Also, the other day, I hit Andrew up on Facebook about coming on the show again to discuss his book, and he said he's looking forward to it. So all we got to do is schedule him.
Outstanding. And you know, it's funny enough, I didn't realize, I read the outline earlier today, but I didn't realize that you had already talked to him. And I reached out to him last night, actually. So he probably thinks that we were talking in tandem. Because I was like, oh, so when are you going to come on the show? Do you have any time in June or July? So anyway, he probably thinks that we already talked. We hadn't talked about it anyway, Andrew, if you're listening. But we can't wait to have you on the show, I guess is the point.
Absolutely cannot wait. The novel is gripping. It's just
it really is. It just draws you in. Like, I mean, he really does a great job of just drawing this mental picture. Like, and that's like the hallmark of a really good novelist, right? Like, I feel like I'm watching a movie almost. I'm like there, right? So it really is good. Check it out. So let's get into the t-shirts now. Sean, what do you got?
Okay, well, today's a retread. I'm wearing the Say Their Names t-shirt. I'm wearing it again because there was a report this week. Unsurprisingly, it's this dirge of these reports of civil rights violations and deaths. This time it was the family of 49-year-old Ronald Green in Louisiana. He was told 2 years ago that by the police that he died in a car accident. Okay, his family was told. And he was actually choked, beaten, and electrocuted to death by cops. And he was also kept face down on the ground for 9 minutes. Where have we heard this before? So all of this is on the cops' body cameras, and until now they were withheld from the public. So this is an unfolding scandal, and it just reminds us that this is not. None of this is over.
That's right. That's right. And we posted, or you or Jillian posted on the Radical Secular Facebook page, something to this effect, right? Black lives still matter. This
Yep.
is still happening, even though it falls from the from the hot headlines because the trial's over or whatever. This sort of stuff is still happening, and it still happened, and people still deserve justice. And interestingly, I'm wearing my Black Power T-shirt today. I'll just show everybody. It's pretty simple. It just says Black Power and multiple lines, and I'm wearing that for a couple of reasons. It happens to dovetail with your shirt and what you were just talking about, Sean. It also is, I think, for me, given the topic for today, and just I'm feeling black and powerful today, I guess. Maybe for no other reason I'm wearing it, but it's one of my favorites. I actually had a work meeting today, and I wore it, and I always kind of feel like, making my little statement at work as well. So
That's good.
Cool. So look, well, let's just get into the show. The most obvious news is the travesty that has unfolded. There was a ceasefire declared today, I suppose, after 11 days of fighting.
Mm-hmm.
But nevertheless, the damage has been done in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. We've seen the images. It's fucking horrible.
It's horrible.
It is unbelievable. It is unforgivable. It is indefensible. We're going to talk more about that later. I know that folks that listen to our show are pretty well informed, but we will touch on that later. I want to first, though, sort of set the tone for that discussion by talking about, I think, a relatively controversial issue, which is some liberals, not all liberals, some liberals, what I'm deeming racist response to Tim Scott. Now, this is going back a while, right? Biden delivered his first address to a joint session of Congress back on April 28th. And infamously, Tim Scott delivered the GOP response that same night. Many liberals responded to Scott by calling him, quote, Uncle Tim, and other euphemistic stand-ins for the, quote, Uncle Tom racial slur. I'd like to start by stating the obvious, because it is obvious, and it's important to restate, though. That is that Tim Scott's politics and his ethics are absolutely indefensible. He takes positions which advocate or defend racist and xenophobic, I don't have to tell you all this, but I'll tell you anyway, racist and xenophobic policies, plutocracy, voter suppression. And he said all this in the speech, by the way, creeping authoritarianism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heteronormative supremacy. And that is to say that Tim Scott is a mainstream GOP politician. He happens to be black, but he's also a mainstream GOP politician in that way. Those politics are outrageous. They're dangerous. They're fascistic. They are theocratic. Why, though, Sean, do you think Tim Scott receives special scorn from liberals for taking the exact same positions as the rest of his absolutely despicable, and I can't say that enough, despicable GOP colleagues?
Well, look, I'll say the same thing here as I said when we were talking about this earlier, because I fell into this trap as well. And really, it's because my expectations that a black man in America would have a greater, not lesser insight into the mechanics of what American racism is than a white person. And I expect somebody like Louis Gohmert or Donald Trump or Ted Cruz or Sean Hannity or Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mitch McConnell, all the usual suspects that we know and despise in the Republican Party, to deny the existence of systemic racism. They do this all the time because they've never experienced it. And it's become basically the central plank in the Republican Party platform to deny that racism exists. This is everything, okay? The so-called opposition to cancel culture and wokeness have become the beating heart of modern republicanism, and they are themselves euphemisms for white supremacy. I mean, I think when a Republican politician criticizes wokeness, they might as well be using the N-word, okay? So it just packs an extra wallop when those words come out of the mouth of a black man. And so when I heard Tim Scott's speech, it was like a gut punch. I knew he was a Republican. I just didn't expect it to be that bad. And so the gut punch from Scott's speech, it was made worse by the fact that just before the section where he said, quote, America is not a racist country, he pointed at himself and he tapped his tie and he said, quote, I have experienced the pain of discrimination. I know what it feels like to be pulled over for no reason, to be followed around a store while I'm shopping, end quote. So he knows that there's heavy racism in America, which is really the same thing as saying America is a racist country. So the dichotomy, the sheer dishonest incongruity of his statements is what really got to me. It felt not just like he was allowing himself to be used by the white supremacists in the Republican Party, but that he was actively collaborating with them. And so he just outright lied on national television after President Biden's speech, and that just pissed me off.
Yeah, and it should piss you off, right? I think that, and I was going to talk about this a little bit later on, but I mean, whatever, it's just an outline. But I hear you, and I understand that sentiment, right? But what really struck me about what you said was the idea that a Black person ought to have more insight into white supremacy or white experience than a white person. And I think that in many cases, most cases even, that's true. It's famously not true or notably not true in some cases. And I titled this show, I Am Tim Scott. And why did I do that? I did that because, and I wrote a blog post around this, and I haven't posted it yet, but I will post it so that everyone can go ahead and read it, because I go into more depth about these issues in that blog post. And you and I have talked about this, Sean, is white supremacy holds us all. Mm-hmm. And it is especially poignant. It's hard for, I think, white people to wrap their mind around the pressure that there is on Black folks to act and be white. And that pressure is even more so felt for folks like me, like Tim Scott, who spend most of their time around white people. If you go to elite universities, if you go and work at a good job, you're going to be around mostly white people. And the pressure to be like white people is enormous. Now, it doesn't mean that Tim Scott made the right decision, that he has obviously gone off the deep end as we begin to describe it. I mean, he is a collaborator. I think that's a really great way to put it. I think that's a great race neutral way to put it. But nevertheless, he's sick. Right. I mean, I think that is the best way to look at this. And one of the ways. And so and I'm going to transition now into my next point. And that is the reason why you said a lot there, Sean. But the bottom line, the sort of theme that woven in through it is that he gets singled out for additional scorn because he is Black. That's the theme, right? Like he's not white, he's Black, and he's saying those things, and therefore it's worse, right? So, and I'm going to say it again, so that the racism is just very crystal clear for our listeners, right? Mm-hmm. So, liberals singled out Scott for especially intense scorn because he is Black, right? I mean, that is like, right? I mean,
yeah. I mean, right? That's the truth.
That's the truth, right? So that is, I don't know how that's not racism, right? So why, and I'm not sitting here casting dispersions necessarily. I'm just saying, like, let's be very clear, because it becomes very complicated when it's like, oh yeah, he's a Black guy saying stuff that sounds white supremacist, and so we should hate him for it. But racist slurs are always morally reprehensible, right? And even when they're hurled at people of color with whom we disagree. Why do you, like, Sean, comment on that?
Well, look, I mean, I had a what I felt was a natural impulse of, righteous rage or whatever, but I reacted in a way that ended up being hurtful. And this is the part where I really needed to be taken to the woodshed for what I said. And I was, and I'm going to share with our listeners that, we had a conversation. We had a phone conversation that was heated, and you took me to the woodshed, Christophe, and I completely deserved it. I deleted my post about Tim Scott, and truth be told, it never should have gone up in the first place. And so I just have to give some perspective, though, and on my best Joe Biden voice, here's the deal. Here's the deal.
Here's the deal.
Yeah, there you go. That was better. I'm a white man in America, and that makes me an integral part of this system of white supremacy, no matter how progressive I might think I am, and no matter how strongly I might oppose white supremacy, I can't avoid the history of people who look like me. And I have to say, I don't make a statement like this about history primarily out of guilt. That's the thing that gets thrown at liberals by conservatives a lot is, oh, you got all this white guilt, right? Certainly there's plenty of guilt to go around among white people. The atrocities committed by my ancestors, people who look like me, against Black people and Native Americans, they rival absolutely any genocide that's been committed anywhere in world history. Tens of millions of Native Americans were slaughtered, dispossessed, and deprived of their heritage. The slave population of the American South was about 4 million at its peak, but that's only one generation, right? If you add up all the Black people who've been oppressed, dispossessed, some murdered in American history since 1619, the total impact is also many tens of millions of people. So there's certainly collective guilt about this, but for me personally, it's more about the fact that I've lived a privileged life as a white man, and becoming aware of that, I have a sincere sense of obligation to do as much good wherever I can, as long as I can. And it's not white guilt as much as it is just about doing what's right. And sometimes that impulse to do good makes me get ahead of myself. I start acting like I'm not a white man, frankly. I start acting like I have the right to speak for Black people because I believe I understand social justice issues. But clearly I don't have that right, at least not the right to cross the line into slurs.
Yeah. I mean, and I appreciate that, Sean. I know that you are an introspective guy who thinks about this sort of stuff. One thing that occurs to me is, as we talk about these slurs, and I want to read a little bit from my blog post in a moment, but one of the things that occurs to me is that, slurs or whatever, that kind of thinking or approach to issues, it comes usually from a sense of like you said, you said righteous outrage, right? Righteous, like a sense of like, oh my God, this is so fucked up. This is so wrong. And I need to respond to this, right? And I would make the argument, and is that even that is privilege, right? Because I mean, I have those feelings too sometimes, right? But as a Black man, I can't just get angry, right? I can't just react, right? Because when I do that, right? When I do that, I get shot by a cop, right? When I do that, I get called the N-word, right? When I do that, I'm an angry Black man, right? And so even that knee-jerk feeling, and then because like as Black people, we are socialized to restrain ourselves, right? We are socialized to make sure we keep people comfortable. Right? White people comfortable. That is how we're socialized. So, but I'm going to go ahead and just quote now from my, and if you want to respond to that, you absolutely can.
Just want to say real quick that this couldn't be more true. And we saw it come out this week that President Obama was quoted as having used some really choice words about President Trump.
Mm-hmm.
But he kept that to himself, and he kept it under wraps until Trump was out of office. And I think that's an example of what you're describing here. He didn't have that option of flying off the handle.
That's right. And I say this about I've been saying this since Biden came into office from the very beginning, when Biden came into office, is he's able to do things and say things that Obama simply couldn't, because he is an old white man, right? He can propose things even that Obama couldn't propose without outrageous backlash, and Biden's getting plenty of backlash. Don't get me wrong, but nothing along the lines of what Obama has done, and he is proposing more radical stuff than Obama ever proposed. Right. So, of course, the right is going to flip out no matter what. We should expect that from the right, but the race element is a factor. So, racial slurs are. I'm quoting now. From my piece, racial with self-aggrandizing, just full on here. Racist slurs are morally reprehensible for any number of reasons. Among those reasons is that racial slurs and their anti-intellectual equivalents are always overstatements or understatements, and they are therefore always inaccurate. By definition, they eschew nuance, dispassionate analysis, and restraint in favor of overstatement, emotional reactivity, and intellectual indiscipline. They purposefully, or at least negligently, forego thoughtful systems analysis in favor of lazy, emotion-laden demonization of individuals who are caught up in systems. The Uncle Tim / Uncle Tom slur, along with all the euphemistic stand-ins, are problematic for at least those reasons. End quote. And I'll just read one more relevant quote, if you'll all listen,
Of course.
slurs are always wrong precisely because they dehumanize the individuals toward whom those slurs are leveled. No amount of outrage at the heinous conduct of another individual, no amount of even the most justifiable anger grants us license to strip that individual of their human dignity. Once we cross that dubious line, we've lost our ethical credibility. Not with conservatives. I couldn't possibly care less about their approval. Rather, we lose internal credibility with ourselves and with our partners in the progressive movement who care about universal justice. Slurs are specifically designed to cross the line into ad hominem demonization, distortion, and caricature. They have no business within a well-ordered individual, and they have no business within a well-ordered movement. We progressives can do better. And as long as I'm part of this project, the Radical Secular team will do better, end quote. And another element of this is that I can personally identify with Tim Scott, as I said before, right? Is this sort of, I understand the pressures of worldwide white supremacy. And that pressure is extremely, extremely intense for people like me, like Scott, who end up spending all the time around white people. The bottom line is that Tim Scott has been poisoned and is caught up in a system of white supremacy, just like every other Black person on the planet. We should oppose his bigoted anti-democracy policies at every single turn. We should attack him constantly on the merits. But woe to those who lazily demonize him into a racist caricature. On the contrary, we should have empathy and compassion for him. I've frankly been deeply hurt by what this Tim Scott episode has revealed about far too many white liberals. Many such liberals have obviously not fully internalized what anti-racism is. They've apparently not internalized fully what it means to not be bigoted. That burning desire to single out that you folks seem to have experienced to punish Tim Scott, a Black person, on issues related to his Blackness because he doesn't conform to our tribe's standards of acceptable Blackness is bigotry 101. And it is morally reprehensible regardless of its target. It is ad hominem demonization that's inaccurate, intellectually lazy, morally reprehensible, and deeply, deeply counterproductive to the cause of justice. You progressives out there who fell into this trap should learn immediately to recognize, restrain, and control those impulses, or stop calling yourselves progressives, because that's what we're about. We're not like them. We are not like conservatives. Conservatives not only fail to restrain those impulses, they revel in those impulses. And they are human impulses. They're normal human impulses, but as progressives, we have made that commitment to each other and to these causes to hold, to restrain and think through with reason, logic, and perhaps passion and emotion as well, but to restrain those impulses.
Well, okay, so it was really a teachable moment for me. And I think what happened there was that I felt like he so crossed the line that I could cross the line or whatever, some sort of whataboutism justification. And, I got to say, clearly I was wrong about this. I was wrong in my approach. Full fucking stop. No excuses. I'm grateful to you, Christophe, for standing true to your principles, even if it meant calling out a good friend. That's integrity. And it's one of the things that's most valuable to me about doing the show with you and being a part of the project is I'm not just sitting here spouting my own unfettered opinions for an hour and a half. It's an ongoing conversation. And it's also a process of me learning more about myself and my own vulnerabilities. And so what I want to do, though, right here, right now, because it's not taking this back and saying I'm sorry isn't enough. I need to explain how deep the rabbit hole of white supremacy runs for a white man like me, who is at the same time committed to Black liberation, the liberation of all people, but is also a product of a white supremacist system. Mm-hmm. And I realize this isn't about me, but I feel like an explanation is warranted. Growing up in, let's just come out and say it, a more or less racist family and a racist cult community where there were very few Black people, it was easy for me to fall into stereotypes about Black inferiority. I mean, and I think it's true for a lot of people who came from a religious conservative background. My formative years as a child were in the late 60s and early 70s, for fuck's sake. My dad at the time used to rail against the Black Panthers. He was a big supporter of George Wallace. It was like a death in the family when George Wallace got shot. I remember it. I was only 4 or 5 years old, but it made a huge impression to this day. And let's just say also that there wasn't the same reaction in the household when Martin Luther King got shot. And those kind of inconsistencies make a big subconscious impression on a child. Okay. And, if you look at films from that period, Easy Rider came out when I was 5 years old. And I don't know if you remember the scene in that movie where Jack Nicholson says he can get the other two guys out of jail as long as they didn't kill somebody. And then he pauses for a second, at least not a white somebody. So this is 1969, where in a mainstream hit movie in America, one of the characters is joking about the fact that it was okay to kill a black person. So this horrific racist shit is buried deep in our culture. It's shocking to me to watch almost any movie from 50 years ago and listen to any dialogue about black people, just the way they were referred to and dismissed. So, and this is also college. I was in college in, around 1980, and I was parroting talking points that are still being used today by the right wing, because these talking points are not new. At that point, based on what I was saying, I might have just as well been a young Tucker Carlson. I used to say all the stuff he says, like, both sides need to just stop talking about racism. We're only ever going to heal racism in this country if we get off the race train. We're all just one race, the human race, and the infamous "I don't see color." These were things that conservatives said then, as they say them now. And I was a dumb right-wing college kid. I belonged to my campus chapter of the College Republicans. So all that was going on at the same time that I was experiencing and making subtle judgments in my mind about black people, even ones I respected. Okay, I had a black friend I used to eat lunch with in college, and no matter what kind of friends we might have been, I didn't see him as an equal. I just didn't. I mean, it wasn't even a question. It's just how I was raised. And he used to talk to me at lunch. We had this kind of sparring relationship going on, and he used to always say, "Oh, your boy, what your boy Ronald Reagan is doing to black people." And when Reagan got shot, he said, "Oh man, your boy got shot," and he kind of laughed. And I was super fucking offended by him saying that. And I just didn't understand where that level of animus and emotion came from, because I didn't understand about how race or inequality or white supremacy worked at all. And I didn't understand what Reagan's policies might have been doing to affect this man personally. I was just not fucking taught the truth when I was growing up. And I've learned so much since then. And that brings me around to our obligatory weekly mention of Star Trek. We have to do it every week.
Gotta.
Yeah. I've always been a Star Trek fan, as you know, since I was a little kid. But at one time in my life, as much as I hate to admit this, I had a subtle sense that the black characters on Star Trek, like Uhura and Geordi LaForge, were somehow less than the other characters. It also took me some time to warm up to Benjamin Sisko. And I hate admitting that. You don't really understand how embarrassing that is to me as a Star Trek fan, to admit that I was caught up in that sort of judgment, but it's the truth. And these are some of my favorite characters now. And I don't understand my old mindset. I don't understand how I could be the same person. I suppose there's still some of that condescension of racism left in me, as much as I'd really like to just puke it out and be done with it forever. And this is what I think, in a very real sense, I mean when I say I'm a recovering racist. And here's my dilemma in that regard. I know we talked about it being privilege to be able to express that kind of rage, but what do I do with people like Clarence Thomas and Thomas Sowell and Ben Carson and Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron? These people are cutting food and housing benefits to black people. They're defending murder, and they're actively aiding and abetting white supremacy. It just presents an extremely difficult conflict, because I also see that, unfortunately, the same white supremacy is still a part of me on an unconscious level. It's more difficult to root this out than it seems, clearly, which I hate. All of us, black and white, are victims of the same heinous system. So I did, and I have been recognizing this over time. At least a year ago, I recognized that the Uncle Tom slur was off fucking limits. So I stopped. And I came up with that term collaborator as a race-neutral substitute. But in my post about Tim Scott, I fucking slipped up. And I said that he was making a, quote, comfy bed for himself on the plantation. And it's about as on the nose a euphemism for Uncle Tom. I thought I was being sneaky, but, I was basically calling him the house N-word. And, I just, that's not who I am. It's not who I want to be. And I don't know if you remember when Bill Maher said house N-word, but he didn't say N-word. And So there's a lot of liberals who get things wrong on race way more than we should. So anyway, all I could do is reiterate that how much I understand that was wrong and that it was hurtful. And that's the part that gets me the worst and the part that I'm sorriest about, because if you're feeling that way, other people were too. And, it was racist. I'm not afraid to admit it, because I'm in the same position of a lot of progressive white men in America who are trying to do better. And sometimes we fuck it all up.
Yeah. I really appreciate that, Sean. I really, really do. I think that it is, we were talking before the show, and it's as real true now as it was then. And that is that it is, I think it takes real courage to come to terms with this sort of stuff, to admit when one is wrong, to say like, holy shit, like the way I thought I was thinking about this, or the way that I talked about this was not right. And what I wanted to point out also, which I think, and we talked about this when we talked on the phone, and I think it's really important, is that white supremacy exists. White people benefit from it implicitly or explicitly. Black people, but black people, suffer as a result of it explicitly or implicitly. But we're all, like you said, caught up in it. And so those sort of, and this is, I think, not easy to talk about, I think, as a Black person. I think that it takes a great deal of self-reflection. It's and to realize is that, well, you make an analogy. There is a famous experiment where they had a Black Barbie and a white Barbie, and they have like kids come and point out, they ask which one is bad, right? And and kids point to the Black Barbie pretty consistently as bad, and the white Barbie as good. And Black kids do the same thing. Okay. And so that's so really sad. That's really, really important, Sean, because and this goes back to the Tim Scott thing, right? Mm-hmm. This helps put into context for everybody out there how a guy like Tim Scott ends up existing. And it doesn't justify it. It doesn't mean that he's doing the right thing, or we should just say like, oh yeah, well, let's give Tim Scott a pass because he happens to be Black. But it does mean, and this is kind of one of the themes of the show is being able to see the world through other people's eyes, right? It doesn't mean that we agree with it. It doesn't mean that we say it's okay, but we're able to see how they might have got to that conclusion, because that gives us empathy, right? That gives us compassion. And by the way, if nothing else, right, if we want to win a war, you have to be able to see how the enemy thinks. You can't, or else you will lose, right? Right. You cannot just think of them. This is another analogy here. This happened I'm listening to a book about the Battle of Hue in Vietnam. And one of the reasons why America lost the Tet Offensive in general, and Vietnam in general, is because they grossly underestimated what the commitment to that the North Vietnamese had. And that came to this idea of not being able to fully see the world from their perspective, right? That is how you lose battles. That is how you lose battles. And so in terms of white supremacy here, it's important. Black people, as a Black man, I want to be very specific about this because it's not easy to be specific about this, but me as a Black man, I have those same feelings, of those slight feelings of like, of casting inferiority on a Black person, right? Like, it doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen sometimes, right? And so I want to say that if anyone out there who is not recognizing that is simply not being honest with themselves. You just haven't found it yet. That is, we all live in a white supremacist system, each and every one of us, and we are all products of that system. We can't not be. All we can do is be recovering from that mindset.
Yeah, and when you say that, I think it's important to point out that people are not of one mind. We have all these subpersonalities, and every time you're conflicted, you can't make a decision about something. That's two parts of yourself, having an argument with each other. And there are unconscious subpersonalities, okay, of white and Black people who have this immediate knee-jerk reaction. It's why people get shot. Black people get shot more than white people, because
that's
cops
exactly right.
Have this knee-jerk reaction, and before they know it, they've discharged their weapon and the guy's dead. And this is what we're up against, is deep-seated, unconscious racism that we don't even know about. And I think the people who tamp it down and deny that it even exists are never going to get it. Like, you have to come to the place where you're actually willing to say, yeah, I had this bad thought about this Black person. And it's okay, because that means you're on the way to healing.
That's absolutely right. That is right, and it is true of any other marginalized group as well, right? I mean, and that's something that I could talk about from a position of the sort of the privileged side of it, right? I could talk about that as a man, right? I could talk about. I mean, I was at a motorcycle camp. That's why I wasn't here last week, as you know, but maybe not everyone else doesn't know. But I was at an adventure motorcycling camp. It was awesome. One of the instructors was was a woman, tiny woman too, right? and which was really remarkable. I mean, this woman she's a motocross like fucking hero, and here she, you know what I mean, this tiny woman. I dropped my bike probably like 15 times over the course of the weekend, and this woman comes running up to help me lift my bike back up, right? So
amazing.
Amazing, absolutely
firecracker.
Absolutely. But like, if I'm honest with myself, the initial reaction is, this woman can ride a motorcycle, this woman can this you know, and like, it's very, very subtle. Because I'm a progressive, I'm a liberal, I'm a progressive. I believe in women's equality. I realize that woman can ride a motorcycle. Like, my conscious mind recognizes that this woman is an instructor here because she can ride that motorcycle around in circles around me and will always be a better motorcyclist than me. And I'm pretty fucking good. And I know that she will always be better than me, right? But that's my conscious mind. And that goes to what you're talking about in terms of those multiple personalities, right? Because there's something, that lizard brain, perhaps, some level of knee jerk is there. And and those of us, and I'm not always perfect at this or good at it even, but I'm getting better. And that is that I'm getting better at recognizing and realizing that that's the impulse that I need to restrain. That's the impulse I need to call myself out. I think it's very helpful to call oneself out.
And here's the point, and this is why representation matters so much, okay? Because you had that experience now in person, going to this camp and having this instructor and having that thought come up. Wait a minute, what the fuck is this little tiny woman doing as our instructor? Okay. But you noticing that thought and coming to terms with it, identifying and realizing that is something that was there, is the first step to overcoming it. And then you have the experience. And this is the same thing that happens with representation. This is why Uhura was so key in the civil rights struggle, because people began to see, they have that reaction, just like I had as a little kid. You know, what's a Black woman doing on the bridge of the Enterprise? And then all of a sudden, you know, then you can identify that and recognize who and what she was and who and what all these other Black characters were. And that is how things change. And that's why media and entertainment really does matter.
I think that is a really important point. Another example of this is Will and Grace, the gay. There was during the 90s or whatever, early 2000s. This show, this normalized gay people. This made this. Oh wait, they're just like us. Who fucking knew, right? But that way, but that is revolutionary, right? And the Cosbys, another great example, right? Yep. Oh, Black people aren't this caricature. Black people can be lawyers. Black people can be doctors. Black people can be rich, right? Like these sort of ideas are super important, and that's why culture can be an important factor in all of this as well. I want to shift gears now and take some of this sort of perspective into our very conversation of just the awful sort of nightmare that has unfolded in Israel, but really the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Let's not put those things on the same level. The International Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, ICSPA, was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. The ICSPA defines the crime of apartheid as, quote, inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group over another racial group and systematically oppressing them, end quote. I know the answer to this question already, Sean, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Does Israel's oppression of Palestinians meet the definition of apartheid under international law?
Well, yes, of course. And not only do I think that Israel is an apartheid state, I think it's also been committing genocide or ethnic cleansing, if you want to call it that. And I can elaborate that on that in much greater detail if you want. I don't know if
Yeah,
we
go
have
for
time.
it. Go for
Okay,
it.
well, I'm not a historian. I'm not an Israel scholar. I'm not any of those things. But what I do know is that Israelis started arriving in Israel. Jews started arriving from Europe, immigrating to what is now Israel in around 1948. And at that time, that was mostly all Palestinian land. And there were a few places where Jews were moving into. But gradually over time, and then in 1967 with the 7 Days War and various other actions that have happened, suddenly Palestinian territory is shrinking, and people are being moved and removed from the land. And at various times during that conflict, there's been discussion of two-state solution, where there could be peace and there could be territorial integrity. But what has occurred is that since 1967, even the areas that were designated as Palestine there's been inroads made. So there's no longer territorial integrity. There have been settlements to essentially dispossess Palestinians of their land. And so even though what we see happening to Palestinians isn't like they're not being put into concentration camps or ovens like the Holocaust, there's still a genocide because people have a connection to their land. When you mentioned that the Viet Cong were fighting that hard for North Vietnam, it's because of their connection to their land. An invader is always at a disadvantage in that situation, right? So what Israel has done is to just systematically move people off their land. They have disconnected water systems. They have disconnected electricity. They have bulldozed homes, and they have forcibly removed people. And that is part of the United Nations definition of genocide. It can come through land dispossession. It can come through language, forcing people to abandon their language or culture. And it can just come through outright slaughter. So Israel's not doing as much of the outright slaughter as some of the other genocides, but the genocide they are engaging in is very, very real. And now we see that Gaza is basically a concentration camp. I mean, it's got cities, it's got buildings, it's got streets, but people can't leave. There are automated machine guns if you try to leave Gaza, and there's a blockade. You can't get out. Citizens of Gaza don't have passports. They can't travel internationally. So they're stuck. And the median age, this freaked me out when I found out about this. The median age of the population of Gaza is 17.4. So it is mostly children and young people, younger than my sons, like by far is the average age of people in Gaza. And so what's going on there is devastating to this people, and they don't have a future. And so that's what I mean when I say genocide and ethnic cleansing. The pogroms, the riots, which they're calling riots, but I mean, I could go on about this for longer, but I won't.
Yeah, it's indefensible. It is an absolute nightmare. I've read quite a bit about this over the last week to sort of familiarize myself with the extent of the suffering of the Palestinians, and it certainly meets the definition of apartheid. I mean, easily. It's not the same thing as South African apartheid, certainly, but it absolutely meets the international standard. And certainly, in any event, Israel and supporters can't hide behind these technical standards. I've seen this a lot, right? With people like, well, it's not technically this, it's not technically that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. But now you're splitting hairs here, right? And it's incumbent upon the world, but especially the United States, right, to pressure Israel. I was disappointed with the Biden administration's response. It has sounded a lot just like the typical response, which is Israel has the right to defend itself, which is not wrong, of course, but it overlooks a lot of what's going on here, right? The memes that I've seen, right? You have one little Palestinian throwing a rock, and then you have, these guys are flying F-15s, right? F-15E Strike Eagles. These are the best planes, the best non-stealth planes that we have. We don't give those planes away to many people, right? We really don't sell those planes because they are air superiority. This is what they have. They have the best of the best technology. And by the way, Israelis are no slouches in creating their own technology, which is like unbelievably high tech. So we can't pretend like this is one of the things that you've said a lot, Sean, is the problem with both sidesing this. My Facebook world is very small, and so it's curated so tightly. Although I have I have over 1,000 Facebook friends, but it's curated tightly that I don't see a lot of people running around saying, but what about Hamas, right? Most of what I'm seeing is very, very, very pro-Palestine. I think pro-Palestine to a fault, in fact. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I will say though, and again to bring it back to our theme, and I'll hand it off to you to respond after this. But both sidesism and false equivalence, right? They're not the same thing as trying to understand where Israel's coming from, right? Because again, if the goal is there will be no peace without Israel on board, right? So we could just yell at Israel if we want, right? Or we can try to understand why they're coming. And I think a lot of that is because of the same problems we see in the United States and in Turkey and in all over the world. I mean, the right wing, which we rail against on this show all the time, the right wing, the theocrats, the Zionists, all these folks have infiltrated the entire structure of the government there, right? And that's a long part of why we're here, right?
Well, listen, for a long time, there were Israeli liberals who had some influence, but since Netanyahu got in the picture and some of the earlier governments that were right wing, it has just been it's been like having Trump in power, and they are not giving an inch, and they keep pushing with these settlements. And I want to get back to what you said about the apartheid in South Africa. We know, look, this is not remotely the same as South Africa. It's a totally different dynamic. It has its own distinct flavor of oppression. I don't see that Gaza, though, is that different from the homelands that they used to have, Soweto and stuff in South Africa, right? Those homelands were enclaves that these people were forced into, weren't allowed to leave. And how is that different from Gaza?
I don't think it is. Yeah. I really don't think it is. And I think anyone trying to parse that out and try to make those distinctions, I think is operating in bad faith or is not being honest with themselves. Because I mean, Gaza, and you've put it this way, I've said it is an open air prison. And that's actually really, because at least prisons don't get bombed constantly, right?
Well, right.
So, you know what I'm saying? At least prisoners are in some ways treated better. At least they have food every day, right? I mean,
and physical safety,
right? I mean, you might be concerned about being shivved, but at least you don't have to worry about the person who put you in prison maybe just bombing you. I mean, it is. I cannot stress this enough. There is no moral equivalence between what Israelis, and I've been thinking about this a lot, Sean. I'm thinking about, we talked about earlier how the experience of being a kid affects the person you are, right? I'm trying to imagine and trying to put myself in the shoes of an Israeli kid, just some Israeli kid who lives in fear of rockets, right? Now, that's not the same as the Palestinian kid at all. Let's not pretend those things are the same. They are obviously not even close to the same. I mean, those rockets are indiscriminate, right? Most of them get shot down, but that kid does still grow up thinking that maybe the rocket's going to drop on them, right? Okay, fine. But again, we cannot pretend that that's the same thing as a Palestinian kid. And in Gaza there is the fact that, oh man, because of the anti-Semitism thing, right? Because that is the sort of the shield that gets pulled up anytime there's any real criticism of Israel. And by the way, and this is what holds the international community from pressuring Israel. And of course, the United States is standing behind them,
Just ask yourself, why hasn't there been a major Hollywood TV series about the plight of the Palestinians? I mean, there have been documentaries for sure, but why hasn't there
Right.
been like a dramatic series set in Gaza, for example? And I think you know why. I think that this is considered like a third rail. That
It is a third rail.
Even the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has been labeled anti-Semitic, and it's like that's what ended apartheid in South Africa was sanctions and boycotts, and
That's
it
right.
started with musicians, and it spread to everybody, and it put pressure on that regime. And things changed. Well, Israel sees that coming. The right wingers see that coming, and they're already preemptively striking against the BDS movement, labeling it anti-Semitic. And so what that means is nobody in Hollywood can touch it.
That's right.
And it's the same thing. It's the third rail politically, even with Democrats.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Chuck Schumer wouldn't even sign on to the resolution, right? Like he won't condemn what's going on in Israel, right? Like this is a third rail. This is a third rail. And in that sense, politicians that are coming out and just saying what needs to be said, I get it, right? Like, and politicians are one thing, activists are another, right? And so like how you have to talk about these things are different. And by the way, being president is also different than being a junior congresswoman from New York, right?
Right.
Those are two very different things. You are head of state. That's one thing. The way you have to talk about this stuff is very different. But I do give a lot of credit for Bernie Sanders coming out straight up, right? Straight up and saying, no, this is wrong. This is wrong. It's not anti-Semitic to say that these people are being butchered. And can we talk about the Hamas deflection? Because that's a huge deflection, right? Hamas and the Palestinians are not the same people for the same reason that Jews and Jewish government are not necessarily the same thing, right? So, and that's an important distinction to make. I am today, and I keep coming back to this, I think it's really important for us to have this conversation without reducing the other person to a caricature, right? Because that gets dangerous very, very fast. And, anyway, that's my rant on that, I think, for now.
Well, when you think about Hamas, there's a lot of things to dislike about Hamas. Okay, they're illiberal, they're theocratic, they are not friendly to gay people or women in general, and they're
Islamic theocrats, right?
They're much more like Iran, than they are like any sort of of progressive liberation movement. Okay, at the same time, they are who represent the Palestinians right now. They are whatever you think about their elections, they are the elected government of Palestine right now. And, there was a time when there was a more secular government, the Palestinian Authority. And it turned out that the Palestinian Authority was disliked by Palestinians because it made too many deals with Israel. And so what happened is the people chose to take a more militant stance. And I think it's about dignity, actually. I think that when you're constantly humiliated, because look, this has gotten bloody, all right? The Intifada, 10, 15 years ago, there were thousands of suicide bombs going off in Israel. I get why the walls are there. I get all that stuff. It's a horrible situation. But before any of that happened, okay, the territory was taken and a two-state solution was taken off the table. And so when you're desperate, you do things like detonate suicide bombs or elect Hamas.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that's an important point, an important perspective. I think I quibble though with the Hamas thing. I mean, I think that for me, in my perspective, and again, I am relatively ignorant, and I'm not a scholar on this issue. But first of all, I mean, I posted a meme earlier last week, which was that, and I was in the shower and I thought of it, and that is that it was a play on MLK's statement that a riot is the voice of the unheard, right? Mm-hmm. And I made a play on that, and I said a rocket is the voice of the unheard, and I don't think that's wrong. I also don't, and that's why I said it. I think that I understand that frustration for the same reason why I shrug my shoulders when people talk about their businesses, which by the way are insured, getting broken into during a during a riot. I mean, when you are hopeless, you do things that are consistent with hopelessness. I very much understand that. That said, I, again, thinking of the Israeli kid, right, or just being Israeli. And by the way, friends of mine who are Jewish, like, I'm trying to think. I'm making an analogy here, and perhaps I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here. And but the feeling that I get when a Black person is shot, the feeling that I get when I hear racism, when I hear, Trumpian right-wing rhetoric or whatever, right? It's a very, very intense sense of solidarity, right, with the folks, with Black folks, and so I can understand where Jewish people and Israelis especially would have a tendency to rally around, right, their cause, their little piece of the world, and of course the history of what Jewish people have experienced in all of human society, human of the existence since the very beginning, right? They have been ostracized, homeless, pogroms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now it is also true, right? And so I understand that perspective. I don't think that absolves them of what we're seeing here. Obviously, I mean, I hope I've established that in the first instance, because that is not. I don't want to both sides this, but again, trying to see it from that perspective, I think, is also important.
Well, it's very clear that there is some serious injustice going on right now, and I almost see it in the form of the oppressed becoming the oppressor. And I know that Jews don't want to hear this, okay, and it's certainly not all Jews agree with what's going on, and that we have to recognize that there is great diversity of thought both within and without Israel in the Jewish diaspora. Okay, it's not, nobody's monolithic here. It's not like every Jew is now in solidarity with Netanyahu and what he's doing. I mean, he's
certainly not. I mean, I've seen plenty.
About to lose control, of parliament, and so, and I think that there's a possibility that this entire situation may have stemmed from that, but that's a conspiracy theory. So it's not really worthy of being repeated. But
right,
it's kind of a coincidence that this happened at the same time as he was about to be unable to form a government. Okay, but still, we have to keep our eye on the ball that this is a common theme in human history, that oppressed people, because of that experience, have wanted to put themselves in a position of power so that they would never have to repeat that experience. And so I get where Israelis are coming from in that situation. They want to establish a military that's so strong, and borders that are so strong, and the Iron Dome that's so strong that they can't be attacked, and that they're never again going to have to face conditions like they faced in the Holocaust. I completely get it. But it's at this point become an overreaction.
Yeah, I mean, that's an understatement of what we're seeing here, and what has happened is that militant factions have dominated our legislature, right? Like, I mean, next time I go to a different country, even when I've been out of the country during Trump's term, my instinct was to pretend I was a Canadian. Honestly, I was literally embarrassed for. We have a clown for a president, and it would be one thing if he were just a clown, but he's a wildly dangerous man, right? But again, we aren't all Trump, right? And so what has happened is in what's clear, but it's happened in Israel, is that the right-wing factions have really taken over. I mean, one of the things that was incredibly the most disturbing to me, and you listened to it too, not disturbing, but really not even eye-opening, but just infuriating perhaps. And that was listening to this woman who came on Pod Save the World. And she was interviewed, Palestinian woman, an activist, an author, and her telling of her experience in in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, it's harrowing. And
this is what got me in the heart, and hers and other stories like that is what led to me posting the Palestinian flag and saying, Palestinian lives matter. And because this is gut-wrenching shit.
And it is. And it really, really is. And I think that we definitely ought to, right, man. So as I think about this, right, and I said this earlier, there is politics. Everything is politics, fine. But there's politics and there's diplomacy. There's politics, there's diplomacy, and there is activism, right? And those three things all have their place. They all nothing changes without all three of those things, right? What I worry about is when we a couple things. First of all, as I talked about, we talked about at the top of the show, caricaturing people, right? Mm-hmm. That is not only just inherently wrong, although I'm not really let's not get into Kant or whatever. But it has negative effects. It has negative effects because it undermines our own ability to see that person's perspective in a way that allows us to perhaps beat them. Right. We still may want to beat them, but we need to be able to see them as not a caricature. Right. And so that is really important for diplomacy. Perhaps you want to actually get away from that for activism. For activism, maybe you really do want to basically be right, because at good activism, this is why Bernie Sanders is so brilliant, right? Because and why someone like, for example, Hillary Clinton or even worse, John Kerry is right. You can't bring a white paper to a rally, right? You bring a slogan to a rally, right? You bring a fucking slogan, and slogans break really sort of crystallized ideas, right? I stand with Palestine, Palestinian lives matter, Palestinian flag, right? These things are really important. I just hope it's equally as important as that we communicate the nuance that is there. Even though we might think that, even though someone is, like you said earlier, or you were going to say, or we talked about, someone is always more wrong than the other person. Like there is almost always, really rarely is there a 50-50% split. But nevertheless, right, we need to talk about that. We need to talk about that if we want to win, as opposed to just say stuff, right? And again, there's a place for that too.
Like you said, it's a place for both. Slogans change history. Black Lives Matter changed history. It is changing history. Many other slogans are oversimplified, but if you're trying to rally people to a cause, you use those oversimplifications, right? And you still have to be able to talk about what's really going on. And I think that may have been the issue, that came up between us on this Israel-Palestine question, because we're confusing reasoned analysis for kind of sloganeering. And I think that when I post something that says you're either with me or you're against me, kind of thing, or you post rockets are the language of the unheard, okay? Mm-hmm. They're both kind of fighting words, because if you're a Jew and you're hearing rockets are the language of the unheard, and your family is in fear of losing their lives to these rockets, right? Those are fighting words. And so that's right. It's kind of the same as me saying Palestinian lives matter and kind of taking the side of Palestine, right? Because there are more than there are things that are said and there are things that are implied. And I think that, just as when someone says Israel has a right to defend themselves, they're effectively saying it's okay for Netanyahu to bomb Gaza.
That's right. No, that's a great point. That's a really important point. That's a really, really important point. Or I stand with Israel, right? Which implies that everything that Israel does is fine, right? It need not actually imply that, but that might not be what the person's trying to communicate, what that person actually believes if you talk to them about that. But that's certainly what it communicates, right?
Yeah, you have to decide what frame are you in. Are we sloganeering? Are we trying to throw slogans at each other and score immediate moral points, or are we having this nuanced discussion? We can do both.
Yeah, I think we need to do both, right? I mean, and maybe that's the takeaway here, without getting into both sidesism, ironically, right? But no, but seriously though, right? I think that is, I think that's really, really important. I'm glad that we sort of that we're hammering that out, because I do think that, one thing that I try to do, and I'm not saying that this is what you should do, but I think that what I try to do, is it depends on what I'm posting for. If I'm posting for the radical secular, then I'm usually much more edgy about it, right? Because because that's sort of our brand, right?
We are the radical secular, and that's this is especially true when it concerns issues where there's a huge power imbalance. That anti-hierarchy is literally the basis of our show. So we are kind of forced to take sides when there's a situation where you've got a massive injustice taking place. Don't you think?
I do think that's right, and I think that it is. I still think though that because at the same time, right? And this is interesting. Actually, I'm thinking about this now, and that is that we on the show we have, I think, very nuanced conversations, right? We talk about things in great depth. In fact, I think that we get into the nitty gritty, and we don't pull punches either. I think we're pretty clear about that. But social media is harder. It's a harder place to do that, right? It is a harder place to have those kinds of discussions. It's a place where people have 30-second time, 30-second, perspectives. What's the word I'm looking for? 30-second
sound bites.
Sound bites. They're looking for. People are scrolling. That's the bottom line. People are scrolling, right? And if you want to catch their eye, you should probably catch them eye with something big and bold. That said, I think that, and look, I mean, perhaps we just have a slightly different approach to these sort of things, and I think that's fine. We aren't fascists here, right? Right, and we're both working towards the same goal here. But I think that my personal approach is certainly if I'm posting as myself, or even if I'm posting as the radical secular, which I really don't do on Facebook so much, mostly on Instagram, but is to sort of have perhaps like the image or the slogan or whatever, and maybe a sentence or two that says like, that explains, kind of puts it into context a little bit. But again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily what you should do. I think that you Sean, have a brand and an approach that can be extremely effective. But I do think that it's important that, and I'm glad that we did talk about this, right, is that this distinction between sloganeering and why that can be important and useful and rallying, while simultaneously not necessarily circling the wagons too tight so that you are cutting people off, right? Because what ends up happening is that then there are people that never want to listen to us. There are people that are already with us, and then there are people that are slightly just like we make them feel a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, but they kind of understand what we're saying, and so that's a group of people that we want to.
It is Venn diagrams, okay? And what happens is that sometimes, I mean, I had a. This is really actually fucking tragic, if you ask me. And I don't know. I don't know. This is a person that I interviewed on my old show, and he started an organization called Truth Wins Out, and it's a really good organization. He did a lot for the LGBT community, and he's been progressive and staunch. And he actually had a real radio show for a while. I believe it was in Chicago. But anyway, my point is that he started just viciously going after me on my page about the things I was saying about Israel. And he's one of these guys that, just doesn't, I don't know, doesn't think that Israel could do any wrong. He talks about it, what I'm saying as being anti-Semitic. And I mean, I blocked this person, and I don't feel good about it, but it's like, how the hell can I have someone on my page who is going to tell me that I'm being too radical when kids are being bombed? I don't get it.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, I don't think that you should tolerate any that kind of harassment. That's for damn sure. Or like, I think I approach this sort of thing differently. I would probably just ignore him. But I totally get where you're coming from on this. I think that the fallback position of just calling the person anti-Semite is unbelievably dishonest. I mean, I think it's the same thing as pulling up the I am like, this is what conservatives frequently accuse liberals of saying, no, that everything is racist. The big difference here is that in America, everything really is racist, right? Like that, we're not making that up. I mean, we just talked about for a half hour how the fundamentals of this country are premised on white supremacy, right? So, and
Israel is not. All Jews are not in agreement with what Israel is doing. It's
absolutely not.
It's probably 50-50, just like it is here with Trump, where you have these close elections, right?
Exactly. And look, I mean, let's be honest, right? In the United States, it's not even 50-50. It's more like 32-30-70, right? It's just that they have disproportionate amount of power. And we might be seeing the same thing unfolding in Israel, right? Where you have a powerful minority steeped in, we talk about hierarchy, right? Steeped in hierarchy, steeped in theology, steeped in these terrible, terrible ideas, the things that we rail against all the time. I highly doubt if you go to Tel Aviv or you go to these very cosmopolitan cities that you average Jewish guy off the street that he's like, oh yeah, fuck those Palestinians. Let's kill them all. I just don't think that's probably true. And in fact, expatriate Jews and American Jews tend to be even more hawkish, right? So you have these interesting dynamics, but we can talk about these dynamics. And again, we're getting toward the end of the show, but we can talk about these dynamics, and we need to be. I talked about at the top of the show about being uncompromisingly straight with what's happening there. There is a grave injustice that is happening there, and it's been happening there. It's not new, right? And I mentioned how I have complicated feelings about how I feel about Hamas. I think that there is. I understand why Palestinians would vote that kind of group into power. I also hear from the Palestinian side that a lot of people just fucking hate Hamas, right? A lot of people fucking hate Hamas too. The same way people hate the fucking Taliban, right? There's
not unity on both sides. And I have to say, by the way, that a lot of there's a phenomenon in Israel, very much like here, where there are these right-wing settlers who are kind of like brown shirts.
Yes.
They run around with their guns. They terrorize Palestinian people and other Arabs who are living in Israel, who are citizens, right?
Yes.
This isn't just going on in Gaza and the West Bank. This is going on all over Israel, where there have been these settlements. And by the way, this whole thing was touched off by East Jerusalem. They're trying to complete a ring of housing around East Jerusalem that is literally going to cut off Jerusalem from ever being the capital of Palestine, right? So there's all this jockeying that goes back, like I said, to 1948, and the Israelis have not stopped taking territory, and every year it gets worse. So, and they haven't stopped terrorizing people within Israel, and they haven't stopped terrorizing Palestinians who have to cross the border. And so it's a terrible situation. And until we get rid of the hawks, okay, and I'm not going to say on both sides, because honestly, I think that if you get rid of the hawks on the Israeli side, that the Palestinians are not going to reelect Hamas.
Right. It's a last, like, I mean, your argument is, and maybe it's true. I'm not saying that it's not. And although I'm not certainly, I agree with it, but your argument is, and I think it's a good one, is that it's essentially a fallback position, right? It is a desperation move, right? It's a desperation move. And there's no doubt about it that the Palestinians has every reason to be 100% desperate, right? They have every single reason. Depression is incredibly high. Unemployment's at 50%. Right. There is the blockade has been going on for, I don't know, like a decade, right? The fucking blockade forever. They are living in a prison, and it is beyond the pale. And, I was talking about earlier how, we Americans, you and I, for example, aren't the same as Donald Trump, right? We aren't the same as our government in that direct sense. That's the same for Israelis as well. But it's also true that we as citizens, you and I, and the rest of the progressives that we know, and all of us have a responsibility, right? Because the right wing in America couldn't exist unless there were citizens who were willing to acquiesce, citizens who were willing to look the other way, and then citizens, of course, who are like full on into it, right? So, so we aren't the boat of government is a slow one that turns slowly. So it's not like, you know, our podcast or our show or our words are going to turn that boat, but we do have to do our part, right? Whether that be by voting, by speaking out, and by not looking the other way, because we can all just look the other way. I was, you know, to make a quick analogy, I was on this motorcycle trip and I realized that I was one shirt short. So I didn't have a shirt for one of the days. I was like, oh shit, I need to go. So I went to Walmart and I was like, I'm going to buy a shirt. So I go and buy a cheap shirt and it was like, I don't know, like $9 or something like that. And I go and I go to pay for the shirt and I'm like, and I said explicitly to myself, this shirt is cheap because a slave made it. That's
right. That's fucking true.
That's why, right? And that, so I'm not going to not buy the shirt, right? We talked about systems at the top of the show, right? Like, right? We live in a system that, I mean, I could go off the grid. I could make my own clothing. No. I mean, I guess I could, but that's not realistic, right? So I'm going to buy the shirt, but I'm not going to turn a blind eye. I'm not going to pretend that that shirt wasn't made by a fucking slave in Indonesia or wherever the fuck else. And I'm going to say slave. Because that's exactly what it is.
Well, this is what I was talking about earlier at the top of the show when I was saying that having these thoughts, having these realizations is the first step to changing the situation. And we are not capable of getting out of our current globalized system anytime soon. As we work to make the system more just, we still have to continue to use the system, just like Al Gore when he was flying around trying to help save the climate, and he got incredibly criticized for that. But that's just the way it is, right? He could have been flying a private jet to a football game.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And similarly, I think that it's incumbent upon Israelis, even though they may be liberals, and right, there are liberals in Israel, and they are probably appalled the same way that we're appalled of what's happening at the southern border, right? Like,
for sure,
we were appalled for fucking 4 years. We sat here and we railed for 4 years, and about what was being done in our name, right?
Yeah.
And I'm sure they are too, but we have to do what we can do. That's, first of all, like I said, not turn a blind eye, vote accordingly, speak out, but also do so, and I think in a way that's thoughtful.
Well, you have to think long term. If you are Israeli of whatever political persuasion, what is it going to take for Israel to succeed?
Right.
Because Israel's not going anywhere. They're going to be there for the long term. Does Israel want to be a country at peace with its neighbors, or does it want to be guilty of committing genocide? I mean, it's a stark choice right now. There are a couple of paths forward, and the way forward is not more bombing. It's not, it's not more pressure on the Palestinians. It's not cutting off more of their power or making a tighter blockade or destroying their tunnels. That's not the way forward. The way forward is to figure out how to make enough concessions so that the Palestinians aren't so desperate that they keep electing Hamas.
Yeah. And I think that's right. I think that's right. I see this from the perspective of your average Israeli, right? But again, there is no real comparison here. There really isn't. Ironically, it is David versus Goliath. Ironically.
It is flipped around, right?
Flipped around. What an irony! What an irony, right? And again, if anybody who is pro-Israel and not being willing to admit that is just simply not being honest with themselves, right? If you are, and that is true of the Palestinians, of looking at the Palestinians as well. If you are looking at this as good guys versus bad guys, right? You're overlooking that these are people.
Mm-hmm.
People who are caught up in oh, what a fucking mess, caught up in a dangerous, deadly mess. But look, we could probably talk about this all day, but we really should wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts before we move on?
I just want to say that I think that based on the first part of the show and the second part of the show, and coming to a point of understanding and balance and calm discussion, that it's evident to me that the fight for social justice is as much internal as it is external. Okay, it's a fight that's going on within each person, between the better angels, and the primitive brain kind of thing. And however you want to look at that, it is something that no matter what the external events are that are going on, it's always a process. We can't fix the world if we don't have our own integrity and our own house in order. And so that's my final takeaway today.
That's really well said, Sean. I really do think that the fight, the struggle begins inside and builds out. I really do think that is true. And, it's if we aren't well ordered, we cannot be effective at fighting this stuff. And at the same time, and I think one of my takeaways from the show also, first of all, I think one of the biggest takeaways is our discussion about the sloganeering versus nuance and where both of those things work and why both of those things are super important. I think that's really important. But in general, I think those inner demons and being brave enough to confront those and be honest with ourselves about those, and then realize that other people are also dealing with those same things and perhaps understanding that, but still standing firm against the practical outcomes of those, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's been a really awesome discussion, Sean. I am grateful to be able to do this with you, and I'm grateful to everyone else out there who is listening. And if you do like our show, and if you got to this point, you probably do, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, check out theradicalsecular.com, and tell your friends to listen. New episodes post Mondays at noon Eastern on YouTube and all the major podcast channels. And if you are into reading, check out the blog at theradicalsecular.com. And in fact, check it out even if you're not into reading, because it's fucking fire. I'm Christophe Defoe. Thanks for being here. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.